Welcome to Israel Now News. I'm Yochanan El Rom.
And I'm Rivka Rand.
Our top story is the explosion at an Iranian National Guard command center just outside of Tehran. Although Iranian officials are claiming only one explosion occurred, several media outlets have reported multiple blasts at two separate Revolutionary Guard bases. Ramizan Sharif, spokesman for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, initially released a statement that 27 personnel of the Revolutionary Guards had been killed and 16 others wounded. The casualty numbers were subsequently lowered to 17 dead and 15 wounded. Sharif said that the explosion occurred while a consignment of explosive devices was being moved out from the arsenal when some munitions in the arsenal exploded. The Red Crescent reported that ambulances were denied entrance to the site of the blast due to the sensitive nature of the work done on the base. According to reports by Iranian opposition groups, the explosion took place at the base where the 5th Ra'ad Missile Brigade is stationed. This brigade is responsible for launching Shahab-3 missiles. These sources have reported that the explosion was caused by a failed attempt to mount a nuclear warhead on a Shahab-3 long-range missile. Israel Now News reported last week on Iran's intention to attach a nuclear warhead to the Shahab-3 missile, which can reach Israel's main infrastructure. Among those killed in the blast was Hassan Mokaddam, head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's missile development program and supervisor of certain sections of Iran's nuclear program. With more on the Iranian nuclear issue, Rivka Rand.
Despite the IAEA's recent report clearly detailing aspects of the Iranian nuclear program as being tailored specifically for military use, the United States has reiterated that it is not giving up on diplomatic measures with Iran. Ben Rhodes, the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, stated that although Iran has been unable to demonstrate the peaceful intent of its nuclear program, the United States is focused on a diplomatic strategy which increases the pressure on the Iranians through financial and economic sanctions. President Obama emphasized that the sanctions have had enormous bite and scope. He also vaguely alluded that U.S. military action is being considered. He said, "We are not taking any options off the table. Iran with nuclear weapons would pose a threat not only to the region, but also to the United States." According to a recent poll commissioned by the Anti-Defamation League, 57% of Americans support an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear sites, while a smaller majority endorses a U.S. strike on Iran. The poll, entitled American Attitudes Towards Israel, the Palestinians, and Prospects for Peace in the Middle East, reflects that 63% of Americans consider Israel a crucial ally and said that the Jewish state's relationship with the U.S. does not undermine America's image in the world.
In a sudden move, Syria has been suspended from the Arab League in an attempt to curb the violence against Syrian civilians. The Arab League called on the Syrian army to stop the killing of civilians and said that it was suspending Syria from its regional body in a move that is meant to pressure Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Economic and political sanctions will be imposed on Assad's government, and the Arab League is threatening to withdraw its member countries' ambassadors from Damascus. This punitive measure comes after Assad's failure to abide by the conditions to halt all violence, release detainees, withdraw armed elements from heavily populated areas, and allow unfettered access by journalists and Arab League monitors. 18 countries voted to rebuke Syria by suspension from the Arab League. Lebanon and Yemen voted against the expulsion, and Iraq abstained from the vote. The League's decision dealt a stinging blow to Syria and could open the door for broader international sanctions. Syrian state television showed hundreds of demonstrators rallying in support of the Syrian president after the Arab League vote, although many anti-government activists claim that the citizens were forced to join the pro-Syrian demonstrations against their will. Hours after the vote, the diplomatic compounds of countries critical of the Syrian government were attacked. The Saudi, Qatari, and Turkish diplomatic posts sustained severe damage. Turkey sent a plane to Damascus to evacuate the families of its diplomats and non-essential staff. The Arab League had previously announced that an agreement was reached with Syria aiming to stop the violence against anti-government protesters, but the killings only intensified. The conflict has taken a dangerous turn and fears of a civil war are very close to becoming a reality, especially considering that more than 20,000 Syrian troops have defected with their arms and are attempting to organize an opposition army. The Syrian Free Army, under the command of Colonel Riyad al-Assad, has formal backing from Turkey, who has even gone so far as to provide private security detail for Colonel Riyad Assad. The rebel army is responsible for the attack on a bus in which 9 members of the Syrian military were killed. The UN estimated that 3,500 people have been killed in Syria since mid-March when the uprising began. More recent figures push the death toll closer to 4,000.
3 cars were torched last week in Brooklyn, and swastikas and derogatory slogans about Jews were painted on a nearby bench and next to the burned cars. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg said that the NYPD was working to track down the assailants. He said that the fact that this most recent attack came on the heels of the 73rd anniversary of Kristallnacht may or may not be a coincidence. Either way, this kind of hateful act has no place in the freest city, in the freest country in the world. Assemblyman Dov Heinken, who lives just 2 blocks from the scene of the crime, told the New York Times that the area of Brooklyn that the crime occurred contains one of the largest concentrations of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. He said that the violence, referring to the 3 car explosions, adds a sickening dimension to this type of anti-Semitism. He said, "I worry that my mother, who survived Auschwitz, would now have to see swastikas again."
Now to news in Israel, and the country is reeling from a terrible tragedy that claimed the life of 55-year-old Rabbi Dan Merzbach, a resident of Othniel, a community close to Hebron. Rabbi Merzbach was driving to pray at the Tomb of the Patriarchs early last Friday morning when he apparently missed the flashlight signals by the IDF to halt at a makeshift roadblock. Fearing that their lives were in imminent danger, the soldiers opened fire on the rabbi's car, instantly killing the rabbi and wounding his 2 passengers. Poor visibility and high speed might explain why the rabbi failed to stop or even slow his vehicle. The IDF was responding to a report that a suspicious vehicle was driving in the area, attempting to enter different communities without its headlights on. A security guard noticed the strange vehicle and alerted the IDF, who began to canvass the area and created a roadblock at Ha'ari Junction. One of the most sensitive in the Hebron area, Ha'ari Junction, has been the site of several recent terrorist attacks. There's been a rash of recent assaults on civilians in that area, and the IDF is on high alert throughout Judea and Samaria against abduction attempts. One of the passengers wounded in the car was in fact the widow of a man who was recently killed in a terrorist attack. Rabbi Dan Merzbach was survived by his wife, 5 children, and 10 grandchildren.
A dual French and Israeli citizen who resides in Ma'ale Adumim, Israel, was recently informed by the French government that his country of residence and his new French passport would be listed as occupied Palestine. The Israeli Foreign Ministry was amazed that Ma'ale Adumim was considered by the French government to be part of Palestine, a country that has never existed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly stated that Ma'ale Adumim is a community which will remain in Israeli hands under any future final status agreements with the Palestinians. The French Foreign Ministry is being contacted by Israel to ensure that this mistake does not happen to any other residents of Ma'ale Adumim or any other city in Israel.
And that concludes the news portion of our program.
Now stay tuned for Ask the Source with your host, Josh Reinstein.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Source. I'm your host Josh Reinstein, and we're reporting from our rooftop studio in Jerusalem. As you can see, the old city is behind us. Our guest today is Mark Zell, the representative of the Republican Party here in Israel. Mark, thanks for coming on the show.
Josh, great to be here.
Mark, first off, we see a lot of support coming from the Republican Party. Why are Republicans so supportive of Israel?
Well, I think they understand, Josh, that Israel being the only representative democracy, any democracy in the Middle East, the only country in this whole region that really shares American values, the Republican Party understands that, and they, unlike their Democratic counterparts these days, stand behind those values and support Israel.
You know, a lot of our viewers ask me sometimes, you know, if Republicans are so supportive of Israel, then why do Jews normally vote for Democrats?
Josh, that's the $64 million question. I think it has a lot to do with history, and it has a lot to do with kind of social priming. I think what's happening, though, today, Josh, and we just saw this in the election in September in New York's 9th Congressional District, where we hear from Republicans abroad played a major role in that election, is that if you get the message, the Jewish message, the Western message, you know, out to the voters, and they understand it clearly, free and clear of all the other side issues, some of them which are very important. When they see it from that perspective, then they understand what's at stake, and then they vote the way they should. And in that election, which hadn't sent a Republican to Congress for 90 years, they elected a Republican by 8 points. Amazing, just amazing.
Well, we also see a divergence between how Jews who are former Americans in Israel vote in America and how Jews in America vote. Why is there a difference between how Israeli Jews from America vote in elections and how American Jews vote in America?
Well, the answer to that I think is easier to give, and that is when we get over here and we see things from perspective, from abroad, from living in the land of Israel, in the Holy Land, Josh, we can divorce our perspective from all of those other issues, you know, whether it be the environment or, you know, pro-life or, you know, immigration, all those other issues which are of concern to American voters in the United States. But over here, American voters who live in this country understand what's at stake, and what's at stake here is the survival of the area's only democracy and the world's only Jewish state.
Well, the big question now is who's going to get the Republican nod. First it was Mitt Romney who was head of the polls, then it was Rick Perry, now it's Herman Cain. Do you have a take on what's going to happen in the next couple weeks?
I don't, but I can tell you one thing. We here in Israel are watching the debate with keen interest. In fact, many of the presidential candidates come over here and meet with us. We had an opportunity to meet with one of them for 2 hours. And I think the debate that's going on there is very constructive, very interesting, and it's democracy at work. I mean, this is what the American system is all about. It's not somebody who can come in and buy the election like you have in other countries in the world. This is the people are going to decide. People like your viewers here today, they're going to pick among these candidates, and they got a lot of good candidates, and we'll see in a few months what happens.
Now, Mark, you're also an expert in the Middle East and Middle East affairs. The big question here in Israel now is what's going to happen with Iran? You know, they're trying to get a nuclear weapon. They're feverishly working to get it so they can enact their official policy of wiping Israel off the map. What do you think is going to unfold in this situation?
Well, boy, that only the Almighty knows, Josh. But I'll tell you, those of us here on this part of the world have a lot to be concerned about because we're really on the front lines. I mean, those nuclear weapons, if God forbid Iran ever gets them, will be aimed at us first. But we won't be the last target. And they'll be after the Europeans, and they'll be after us in the United States too, because what they're really aiming to do, and they've said it, is to destroy the whole Western civilization and its value structure. We've got to prevent that. I don't believe the Iranian people themselves really want this, but the leadership, which is really off the wall, has embarked on this very dangerous course of action, and it's up to us, principally in the United States, and here I turn to your viewers again because they've got to understand this. This is principally an American concern. If there's anyone that's going to take the action to stop the Iranians here, it's the United States. We need strong leadership for that. But Israel is prepared to do its part, and we're hearing this week how the whole public here is engaged in discussing what those ramifications will be and what our role will be.
Well, another issue which is of major concern to the United States and also here in Israel is the fact that the PA is going forward in the UN to try to declare a Palestinian state unilaterally. What kind of reaction do you think we can expect to see from the United States in the next few weeks?
Well, the first thing, I would hope that the president stands by his promise to exercise a veto in the Security Council. And the second thing is, thanks to Republican leadership and a good bipartisan support in the Congress, we have a law that cuts off U.S. funding to any UN agency like UNESCO that admits the Palestinians unilaterally without going through the proper processes. That's a good start. But the main thing is that the United States stand firm and not let this block of anti-democratic, dictatorial Islamic regimes take over and kidnap the United Nations. And I think with strong support from the American people, they're going to just basically say, hopefully they'll say no to this. If either the UN acts democratically in accordance with the principles that civilization is built upon, or we get out.
Well, we see that with UNESCO. America's cutting off funding of $60 million just a few weeks ago. You know, as I said, there are millions of people who are watching this show, Bible-believing Christians. As a Republican representative here in Israel, what message do you have for them?
First of all, I want to say, hold firm and stand by your faith and keep your support strong for the United States and for the state of Israel. I mean, the support that the Christian community has given to the Jewish people and the Jewish state throughout history, and particularly in these difficult times, is extremely important. And all I can say is God bless you and thank you.
Mark, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Thank you all for tuning in to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein, and now back to the studio.
Coming up next, Shining Light from Israel.
This week we feature an exclusive sneak peek of a new documentary called Israel Inside.
It premieres on PBS in South Florida Tuesday, November 29th at 8 p.m.
What makes the miracles of Jesus even more miraculous? Standing where they happened, in Israel. Come explore Jerusalem, where Jesus opened blind eyes. Visit the hills of Galilee, where Jesus fed the multitude. Stroll through Capernaum, where Jesus lived and taught and healed. To learn more about standing where it all happened in Israel, visit www.goisrael.com. Come visit Israel.
When people think about Israel, they think about war, or religion, or even falafel. But to me, when I think about Israel, I think of the triumph of the human spirit. Israelis, surrounded by enemies, have turned a desert with hardly any natural resources into a flourishing, productive, and caring society. When I think about Israel, I think about a country beyond the conflict, cliches, and controversy, and that's where I want it to be. My name is Tal Ben Shahar, and although I was born and bred in Israel, I spent much of my life living and working abroad. Working in Asia, studying in the US and the UK, and touring the world playing professional squash. I received my PhD from Harvard, and after completing my studies, I went on to teach there.
Ben Shahar teaches a course at Harvard called Positive Psychology, the Science of Happiness. He began the class 4 years ago, and it became the most popular course on campus, enrolling 1,400 students.
He teaches Harvard University's most popular class, Positive Psychology. Please welcome to the show, Tal Ben Shahar. Tal?
It was very exciting to know that what I was thinking about, writing about, and teaching was having an impact. My passion is teaching, and to focus on the positive things in life. In spite of all this, I decided to move back to Israel. The main reason for this move, I would say, is family. For me, Israel is all about family. My wife and I had a most wonderful childhood growing up in Israel, and we wanted our children to have that too, to be near their extended family. And when I came back, I realized that the time and distance away enabled me to see Israel in a whole new light. The Israel I came back to was not the Israel I left. I was amazed at what happened here during the 14 years I was away. The country had gone through another intifada, another war in Lebanon, the peace treaty was signed with Jordan, and Rabin was assassinated. I also noticed social problems like a housing shortage, a shrinking middle class, and a rise in poverty. The country seemed so much smaller, the soldiers so much younger. In the time I was away, tens of thousands of Ethiopians and hundreds of thousands of Russians had come to Israel. All of a sudden, I could hear so many languages spoken on the street: English, Russian, French, Amharic, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese. And the fields where I used to play as a child are now home to some of the many high-tech companies that are all over the country. Israel had transformed. Israel had not only joined the 21st century, in many ways it was now leading the way.
When you look at the NASDAQ, companies are listed from around the world. There's one country, though, that truly stands out, and that is Israel.
Israel is the fastest growing, one of the most dynamic, entrepreneurial, and innovation-based economies on the planet.
The sky is the limit for inventors in Israel.
Israel has been a remarkable achiever in terms of technological innovation.
Israel has developed some of the world's leading technology.
Even if you don't live in Israel, chances are you have something that was made here.
If you just look at it on a daily basis, how much stuff do you use in your daily life that has its origins in Israel? It's rather remarkable.
Many of the microprocessors invented by Intel were designed in Israel.
Nowhere in the world outside of Silicon Valley will you find more technology startups.
People come from all over the world to look for Israeli technology.
Warren Buffett shelled out more than $4 billion for Iskar Metalworking, the largest purchase the legendary investor has made outside the United States.
I understand that their facilities are incredible, but I would expect that.
Intel developed here, HP has a center here, Google is very successful here, Microsoft as well as in research and development.
If you actually do the math, Microsoft is almost as much an Israeli company as we are a U.S. company.
This country has been such a beta site or a laboratory for solving both national and international problems since its inception.
Why not forget the gas altogether?
This electric car may be the answer to high gas prices. No gasoline needed.
The technology coming out of Israel is being used to connect the world, green the planet, save lives, and have fun.
Wow. Wow.
For instance, Kinect lets me use my body as the controller. This very cool technology was developed in Israel and then bought by Microsoft.
It's a workout.
I know that I looked silly, but other than that, I had a lot of fun. When Microsoft was looking for the next best thing in innovation, they turned to Israel.
Israel was able to provide the answer. They were able to provide this innovative technology that really wowed everyone at Microsoft, and they said, yes, this is going to be the next best thing, and it was. It's the fastest selling gaming device in history.
Oh, wow. A lot of innovation has come out of Israel.
In a way, Israel is known to everybody as a center of innovation, as a place where you can find more innovation than anywhere else in the world per capita.
If you look at countries that are represented in these stock exchanges, the ranking today is number 1, of course, the United States. Number 2 is China. And number 3 is Israel. The US, China, Israel. Looking at our size, how is it that Israel, with its 7 million people, has the 3rd largest group of companies traded in New York?
This is an amazing fact for a tiny country to actually eclipse all the nations of Europe in the creativity of its entrepreneurial leadership.
What makes the miracles of Jesus even more miraculous? Standing where they happened, in Israel. Come sail the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus calmed a raging storm. Experience Jerusalem, where Jesus restored a paralyzed man. Explore Capernaum, where Jesus spoke a centurion servant into health. To learn more about standing where it all happened in Israel, visit goisrael.com. Come visit Israel.
Time now for one of our favorite segments, Torah Truth from Zion.
My name is Rabbi David Lichtman from Aish Torah of Jerusalem. Today we're going to be discussing the Torah portion called Chayei Sarah, the lives of Sarah. The matriarch of the Jewish people, the wife of Abraham, had died after 127 years and was laid to rest in Hebron in the cave of Machpelah. Their son Isaac was growing, maturing, and now was ready for marriage. In the story of this week's Torah reading, Abraham dispatches his trusted servant to find the right match for Isaac. After journeying with 10 camels, Abraham's servant finds himself at the entrance to a town at the well, and he turns to God and prays and asks God to bring the right woman. But how would he know which is the right woman for Isaac? How would he know that this is the woman that God is bringing forward and saying this is the right match? And so Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, says, God, the first woman who I ask to bring me some water to drink after my long journey, and in addition to offering me water, giving me the water that I ask for, she also offers to draw water for the 10 camels. That's the woman that I will know you have chosen to be the right match for Isaac. Abraham's house was a house that was founded and predicated on giving, because our primary task in life is to bring out the image of God within us. And our image of God is similar to God. It's a godliness within us. Who is the most fitting wife for Yitzchak, the son of Abraham? And so here we can see that perhaps when it comes to marriage, the aspect and trait of giving is perhaps the most foundational and important aspect. This can help us also understand why in Genesis, in the creation of the world, the Almighty said it is not good for man to be alone, because alone man is lacking someone with whom he can give in a meaningful way, and then woman was created. If we can take this lesson, internalize it, and bring it out in all of our relationships, and especially in marriage, to be giving in the way in which brings us closer together, then we're truly bringing God into the world. We thank you very much. Shalom until next week. I'm Rabbi David Lichtman from Aish Torah. Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Israel Now News. I'm Ruth Karand.
And I'm Yochanan El Rome. Join us again next week.